What keeps me up at night is not World War III or Russia overrunning Ukraine. It is what happens when Putin can't control anything anymore. What happens when Russia runs out of foreign currency reserves? What happens when Moscow becomes as isolated as Pyongyang? Those are the types of questions that you're absolutely right that should be scaring us, because it's very unpredictable and Russia's been very volatile.
Welcome to a new episode, Deep Dive today with Jacob Shapiro. Hi, Jacob.
Hi, it's good to be with you guys.
Yeah, thank you for appearing. Thank you for your time. It's the first time you're on a German channel and the first time you're doing an interview in German as well. No, just kidding. He's like, oh my God, I have to leave. Oh, wait, I don't hear you anymore, Mark. So anyway.
It would just be a fairly short interview if you decided.
Exactly. But with millions of clicks. Yeah, don't worry. It would go viral. So the past 20 years were sometimes somewhat boring as a macro and geopolitical analyst. But over the last years, I think we all saw a paradigm shift. It's crazy out there. We're definitely living in interesting times. And there's this famous quote, I think it's from Lenin, who said, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. So we talked to you because you into the macro as well as geopolitical analysis. So perhaps you introduce yourself to our German audience, because it's the first time you appear on a German channel. So please start your German interview right now.
Sounds good. Well, so I'm Jacob Shapiro. I started, as you're right, as a geopolitical analyst very strictly. And when I started, it was right around the 2008 financial crisis. So there were sort of little signs that maybe the world was beginning to change, but it was still, the U.S. unipolar moment, and the United States was the most powerful country in the world. We all assumed China was going to continue opening up and become a liberal democracy and be a stable partner in globalization, all these other things. And it's been interesting over the course of my career to watch the world sort of slowly change. And then over the course of my career, I started really in publishing and writing and thought leadership and policy reports and things like that. Moved from there into consulting, and then most recently in the last 18 months, I've been working directly as a partner at an investment firm. And I have to tell you, I enjoy working with the investment firm for many reasons, but the most important of which is geopolitics can feel amorphous sometimes. You can make a forecast and, well, was the forecast exactly right? What was your time? Markets are very honest with you. Like, there's a trade and you had a thesis and either it performed well or it didn't perform well. In some ways, it takes the emotion out of it for me. So I've enjoyed adding that investment thing to the geopolitics that I do, because it makes me a better analyst. I sort of have to be able to shift and pivot and come up with new ideas in that sense. So that's where I am right now, from geopolitical analyst in boring times to macro investor, geopolitical analyst in times that, to me, I think a lot of people compare the current world to the sort of eve before World War II. I think that's a really faulty comparison. I think it's the 1880s and the 1890s is the mental map that I like to use. And I actually see a lot of opportunity out there in the world right now. I worry about the world that my daughter is going to inherit. I think 20, 30 years from now, things could get really bad. But I think these next 5, 10 years, I see nothing but opportunity all around the world. And I encourage investors and companies that I work with to get out of the fetal position and say, yes, the world is crazy, but crazy means opportunity. There's nothing going on right now that you can't also capitalize on if you are aware of what's going on and have some sense of the direction that we're going in.
Yeah, crises are always opportunities, of course, and you always see chances in crisis. And recently we spoke to a good old friend of yours. It's Peter Seihan, and you told us you've been an intern to him and you prepared him coffee and so on. So he has a different view of the macro political and geopolitical surrounding right now. So let's for example start with Russia and Ukraine war. For example, what's your take on the war in the Ukraine?
Yeah, I love Peter. I wish Peter was a friend. I wasn't only making him coffee. I was the unfortunate guy who had to go on and go say, Peter, you haven't turned in your report on time. And I'm sure he didn't appreciate this sniveling little intern coming and telling him that he needed to turn the report in on time. But yeah, I mean, I think the title of Peter's recent book is something about the end of the world is beginning or something like that. And I just don't think that's true. I don't think we're at the end of the world at all. Like I said, I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. And the Russia-Ukraine war is a great example. Now, full disclosure, Peter got Russia's invasion of Ukraine absolutely right. I got it absolutely wrong. We were long Russian equities in the weeks before the invasion because I didn't think Russia was going to do it. And part of the reason was I've traveled to Moscow a couple different times, spoken at events there, been a guest there, and every single Russian analyst I knew was whispering in my ear, telling me it's politics. We're not going to invade. Russia's not doing this. This is all sort of a negotiating tactic. And I made the mistake of listening to them. And, that's sort of, mistake number one. You listen to what people are telling you rather than seeing the things that are in front of you. But as we sort of shift to where we're going now, everybody, including Peter, was wrong about the strength of the Russian military, about Ukraine's ability to resist, about where commodities flows were going to go afterwards. And I actually see in Ukraine a tremendous opportunity right now because it looks to me like Germany and other European countries, they're going to do, what did your defense minister say? Well, whatever it takes. I mean, they're not going to abandon Ukraine.
That was Mario Draghi, but same story with the war, yes.
No, didn't Pistorius say the same thing a couple weeks ago when Germany announced the 3 billion euro aid package? I mean, it's the same kind of language. And I think in that sense, that's very powerful for Ukraine because the worst case scenario for Ukraine was that allies like Germany and the US were going to lose interest, or because their domestic politics were going to force them to stop sending weapons or stop sending financial support. And the opposite is happening. You see countries like Germany, the UK, the United States really doubling down, and Ukraine showing the ability to mount a counteroffensive here. And it's not it looks to me like Ukraine is really, preparing for a major counteroffensive. So they're thinking about taking back all of their territory plus Crimea. Hard to imagine that even a year ago. And when you look at the weapons that they're getting, first nobody was going to send them tanks. Now they have tanks. Last week, everybody said no fighter jets. Now F-16s are on the table from the United States. So you put all those things together, it looks to me like Russia's in a very, very difficult place. And if you're an investor, especially, and you're thinking about what the world looks like as this war goes on, think about what rebuilding and integrating Ukraine into the West looks like. What opportunities does that present? It presents immense opportunities for Poland, for Romania, probably for Germany as well, for the European Union in general, for agricultural commodity markets, all these other things. So the direction I see the war going right now is it's going well for Ukraine. They have the support of their allies. They're kicking Russia's butt on the battlefield, and it seems like they have the appetite to keep going further. The thing that keeps me up at night is what happens if the Kremlin folds. What happens if Russia starts to come apart at the seams? And that's where I start having nightmares.
You said the Ukrainian soldiers kick butt of the Russian soldiers, but we just saw Bachmut failed. So there was no counteroffensive, and they even lost this very important city. So we saw this big explosion of this ammunition storage, where I think 500 million or perhaps $2 billion of ammunition got destroyed. We see more and more weapons. You're definitely right. You said last week there were no jets. Now we send jets. Today we say we don't send soldiers. Next week perhaps we send soldiers. Perhaps both of us will be at a war zone. So why is it bullish? And do we get the different information out of Ukraine than you do? Because Bachmut, I think, is a big loss, actually.
This is where geopolitical analysis can start to feel a little sociopathic, right? Because you're absolutely right. Bachmut is terribly tragic and horrific. And we can go to other Ukrainian cities that have been, bombed into the medieval ages that probably won't exist anymore, will have to be completely rebuilt from scratch. But where I would take issue with you is Bakhmut's not that important. Ukraine's defenses aren't collapsing because of the fall of Bachmut. If anything, that's Russia basically grinding a city into nothingness and achieving no strategic aims that it could actually do anything with. And this is where geography really does matter. If you look at a topographic map of Ukraine, it's a flat plain. The whole reason the Russians are in Ukraine is because they want to get all the way to the Carpathian Mountains, because that's a little bit more of a defensible position on the northern European plain. So when you're sitting there in Bachmut or any of these cities that are in eastern Ukraine, none of them are particularly good strategic places. Like, yes, some are a little bit better than others, but that's not really the important issue. The issue is that you're on the plain, and Russia has overextended itself, and despite throwing hundreds of thousands of conscripts and weapons and all sorts of things into the conflict, all it can say for itself is that it's destroyed a relatively unimportant from a strategic perspective city. I mean, like I say, if I had been advising Zelensky, I might have said, maybe Bachmut is not the one to defend. Maybe you pull back your lines, 50, 100 kilometers or something like that and regroup. Ukraine didn't want to do that in part because it wanted to show the West, hey, we're still fighting this war. We can still win. We still need your weapons. We still need your support. But when you look at the trajectory of the war, if countries like the United States and Germany are going to continue giving Ukraine weapons, then they're going to be able to continue pushing. And that's really the whole crux of the issue. If they lose that support, then things aren't going to go well. And I hope that construction sound in the background.
Perfect. But aren't you scared that this whole war will escalate, that we will see perhaps one day soldiers from NATO countries in Ukraine, and that perhaps Russia totally tilts?
If I might add something, as a German, as somebody who lives kind of close to the Ukraine, I'm not so sure I'm super positive about sending the Ukraine fighter jets or F-16 jets. Not sure if that's really a good idea, because from my perspective, I want this war to end as quickly as possible. And I'm aware that's kind of hard right now, but sending more and more weapons doesn't feel like the right approach.
Look, that's sort of a classically German attitude, but you've also seen the German government sort of change its perspective over the last 2 to 3 years, right? The month before the invasion, the German government said, we will only send military helmets to Ukraine because that's what Ukraine is going to need in order to defend itself. You've gone from that to, German industrial companies forming JVs inside of Ukraine to repair tanks and service tanks and things like that. So I think there's going to be an evolution there. The second thing is, if you talk to officials or analysts who are in countries that are even closer to Russia, say in Poland, they don't see fear. They see tremendous opportunity to take a historic rival off the board and then to integrate Ukraine, to rebuild Ukraine, to be the ones that are at the front lines and helping integrate Ukraine into the West in general. So it's sort of a different national perspective there. And this is one of the differences between Eastern and Western Europe. It's been this way for years. Western Europe didn't really care that much about Russia to the extent that they wanted anything to do with Russia. They want business open. They want to be able to, Macron is still talking about trying to be pragmatic in terms of the EU's relationship with Moscow, whereas Eastern European countries like Poland, like Romania, like the Baltics on the front lines said over and over again, you can't trust Russia. Like they're going to try and come for these countries and attack just the way that they have Ukraine. So I hear you, and I don't want people to die or for there to be any wars there as well. But that's just sort of, like I said, geopolitics is not always comfortable, and your choices are: is Russia going to be the dominant power there, or is Ukraine going to resist them and turn them back?
I mean, at the end of the day, war is also always a big business. So I'm not surprised seeing European politicians getting excited about the war and all the business opportunity that arise from that. But at the end of the day, do you really see a reality where a nuclear power like Russia loses this war? I don't see any reality. And you mentioned before, you actually think Ukraine might push back, might even get back Crimea. I don't think there's any reality where this will happen. Do you agree? Do you disagree? How does the world actually look like where Russia loses this war, where Russia breaks down? I don't know. It's hard to imagine.
It is hard to imagine. But let's just take Zelensky at face value. Zelensky says they're going to try to take back Crimea. So whether you believe him or not, whether you think they'll be successful or not, the head of Ukraine is telling you that that's the goal. And when you look at the weapons and the things that they're doing to try and prepare for this counteroffensive, it looks to me like they at least want to be able to make that threat. Now, you're absolutely right, though. And the thing, I already alluded to it, the thing that keeps me up at night, you probably saw this report a couple days ago that there was some faction of Russian citizens who were based in Ukraine who actually attacked across the border into Russia itself, not into annexed Ukrainian territory, but actually a Russian target itself. The Russians say that they beat it back. We can go back to these UAV attacks that the Kremlin was saying happened on Moscow. I don't know whether they're overplaying that or whether that actually happened. But yes, when Russia starts to get threatened, when its back is against the wall, you're exactly right. That is a very, very scary situation. Now, I don't think it's going to bleed outside of Russia and Ukraine. If this war was going to bleed outside of Russia and Ukraine, I think it probably would have already happened. And even despite everything that's happened, NATO's not getting involved. The United States is not sending soldiers. I would be absolutely shocked if Germany ever sent soldiers on the ground to fight this war. It's really just about giving Ukraine the weapons that Ukraine needs in order to push back. Now, what this looks like in a world where Russia loses a war like this, that's really up to Vladimir Putin. And I've been wrong about the Kremlin's estimation of this war, in part because I thought Putin knew that if he tried this, he would fail. And it seems to me that the Kremlin still thinks that it can have success, that it can still hold on here. But if you look around at different parts of the world, you're watching the recession of Russian power in real time. So just today, we had reports that Armenia is talking about ceding Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan and withdrawing from some of the Russian-led security organizations in the region. Okay, so now instead of Russia in the South Caucasus, we're going to have Turkey and Iran probably vying for influence in that part of the world. Go back to last week. Everybody talks about the cozy relationship between Russia and China. Well, what's China doing right now? They're accepting cheap commodities from Russia. And then at the same time, they're holding big conferences in Central Asia and talking about, China is now the big power in Central Asia, this part of the world that used to be under Russian influence as well. So you can see in these peripheral regions, Russia's already losing some of its influence. And the question here is, does Russia have some kind of managed collapse? Does it become just sort of a smaller state, or as I've joked, a Chinese petrol station? Or do we get that Russian Revolution type scenario and the sorts of global impacts that can come from it? I don't know. I think all of those scenarios are on the table. And that's why I say those are the types of things that keep me up at night. What keeps me up at night is not World War III or Russia overrunning Ukraine. It is what happens when Putin can't control anything anymore. What happens when Russia runs out of foreign currency reserves? What happens when Moscow becomes as isolated as Pyongyang? Those are the types of questions that you're absolutely right that should be scaring us, because it's very unpredictable and Russia's been very volatile.
But do you think the biggest commodity producer of the world will ever get isolated, will ever run out of money? Actually, I think that's a very Western-centric view, isn't it? I mean, you are very bullish on a lot of commodities as well. And especially in Europe, we need all the stuff that is located in Russia. So at the end of the day, I think Russia will find a way to keep running because there will be somebody who is buying oil, gas, copper from Russia.
Look, you don't need all the things you get from Russia, and you just proved that last winter. Last September, I mean, everybody was talking about how, Europeans were going to be in the streets freezing over the winter because they weren't going to be able to get access to Russian natural gas. And I told you I was wrong about Russia invading Ukraine. I wrote a piece in September that said, it's going to be a little bit harder. You're going to have to piece together LNG imports and turn on some coal and maybe, consider nuclear and things like that. But there's enough, even like right here today, there's enough natural gas you can get your hands on to move forward. And in 2-3 years' time, when all the LNG projects in Canada and Qatar and all these other countries come online, there's going to be plenty. You don't actually need Russia for all of these different things. Now, the flip side of that is countries like China, countries like India, they don't have that kind of luxury. The flip side of Europe importing all that LNG is that Pakistan couldn't import any of it because they couldn't compete with wealthy European buyers. And that's why Pakistan came out a couple months ago and said, we're giving up on LNG for the future. We're actually going to go back to coal because that's the only thing we think we can actually get our hands on. But I don't think you're right about this idea that Western Europe or even the European Union in general has to import anything from Russia. So you're absolutely right that Russia has lots of different commodities that are going to affect global commodity markets right now. And we can talk about the interesting ways that things like the oil price cap and the ways that, sanctions on Russian energy, which I think are only going to increase over time, have affected energy markets. You say I'm bullish on commodities. I've been talking about being short oil now for a couple months. And you see OPEC is trying to cut production precisely because there's more than enough oil out there. When you actually look at some of these commodities and what the supply and demand fundamentals look like, it's different than the narrative that's being carried from governments or from media that have all their sort of ideological reasons to be there. So there are certain, wheat is a market where I actually am bullish because you can't get Russia out of global wheat markets. There are other things like platinum group metals. You mentioned copper, that, those are going to be harder in general, but Europe does not need Russia. If anything, Russia needs Europe more than Europe needs Russia. There's a limit to what Russia can export to China, because if you're going to build pipelines from Russia to China, I mean, that's an infrastructure undertaking sort of on the scale of the Panama Canal, and you've got to do it immediately because you just lost all of your European customers. So I think Europeans are a little too pessimistic about their position here. I think the crisis is going to do good things for European energy security and lead to finding new energy markets or even investing in new energy technologies.
Talking about pessimism, Peter Seihan, he's very pessimistic on China. So you take it's very positive actually. So please elaborate to our audience why you're so bullish on China, and what's going on with Taiwan? Do you expect there also a war or not?
No, I'm not optimistic about China. But that doesn't mean that the sky is falling. I think there's a room for nuance here where things can sort of be in between. So a great example of this is Japan. So Japan was going to take over the world at the end of the 1980s, and then Japan had a real estate bubble crisis, and suddenly none of the extremes actually happened. Japan just sort of pittered along, and it didn't take over the world, and it didn't collapse. And now finally Japan's coming through sort of the next phase of the cycle. And I think that's the right metaphor for thinking about what China's doing right now. Now, I would say, Peter thinks that Xi Jinping has centralized power and that the emperor has no clothes and that the whole system is about to collapse in on itself. That's a possible scenario, but that's not what the data is showing me. Usually when China starts to come apart at the seams like that, you get warlords in different provinces that start rejecting the authority of the central government. You see these real clashes, and we have thousands of years of Chinese history to watch this process happen. That's not what's happening under Xi. He's centralizing power. He's become really an emperor of modern times, and if anything, the Chinese Communist Party is increasing its control over the country. I don't see that its control is decreasing in any meaningful way. And the reason I think that Xi Jinping is increasing his control over the economy is because, like Peter, he sees the major problems China has with its economy right now. China sort of maxed out on its export-led growth model, and now it has to pivot from making low-cost exports for the rest of the world to stimulating consumption and having the Chinese consumer rise and ascending global value chains and things like that. And the Chinese government's not set up for that. And moreover than that, the social contract in China has been growth and more prosperity and more growth. And that has to shift a little bit. And then last but not least, Xi has to somehow redistribute wealth from the wealthy coastal regions of the country and the relatively impoverished central regions of the country. The Chinese Communist Party has been communist and all, but that's just a name. It's not actually like reflective of what China's policies have been like. So in some ways, Xi has to do what communism really calls for, which is redistribute that wealth from the coast to the interior, and that's going to cause major problems. Now, all of that said, I don't think that this is going to end with the Chinese Communist Party falling in on itself. I think what you're going to have here is a period of years, maybe even a decade, where the Chinese government has its sort of Japan in the 1990s moment. That has to be the thing that they're going for. Can they have enough social stability while they repivot the economy in real time to be more sustainable and to accommodate for this more multipolar geopolitical world? So sky's not falling, but I'm not sure that China's the right place for investors to be thinking about right now. Also, in the context of Taiwan here, this is why I don't think China's going to invade Taiwan. China has much bigger problems at home that it has to deal with, and I don't see that it has the capacity or the strategic sort of forethought to go after Taiwan right now. Even if they did, they just got a front row seat from Russia trying to do this with Ukraine about what terrible things that can do to your national economy.
But to cover problems at home, it's always very, very favorable for governments to start a war. To say, look, we have another problem, a big problem, and we have a new enemy actually, and then you can cover or let your problems at home disappear.
I guess that you could make that argument, but the problem with that argument is that there are a couple of problems with that argument, but the one that I'm going to pick at you with is that in order for that to work, you have to win the war. And China's not assured of winning the war with Taiwan. China's Navy has made leaps and bounds of progress here in the last decade or so. 2 years ago, they just started, or maybe it was a year ago, they just started building their first new modern amphibious landing craft. Those are those ships that would take Chinese Marines and soldiers to Taiwan. They just rolled out their first one, I think a couple months ago. Their first one, the first modern one. So if you're going to mount an amphibious assault against a hardened target like Taiwan, how many hundreds of thousands, even millions of troops you're going to have to get from mainland China to Taiwan? And they have maybe one, maybe a couple of these amphibious ships that they need to take their soldiers to get from point A to point B. They're not even close yet. I think when you're thinking about Chinese strategy doesn't think in European terms. They really are their own thing. And I think the playbook that you're looking for here is not Russia-Ukraine, it's not amphibious assaults, it's Hong Kong. They've already done this before. What China did with Hong Kong was it isolated Hong Kong politically, economically, financially, to the point that when Margaret Thatcher showed up in the early 1980s and said, the United Kingdom would like to renew its lease on Hong Kong, Deng Xiaoping looked at her reportedly and said, okay, well, we're going to turn off the water and we're going to turn off the electricity and good luck supporting the island. We're not going to help you with any of that either. So do you want to renew the lease, or are you actually going to accept that like China's the dominant power here? And Margaret Thatcher, the uber British nationalist who fought the Falklands War to maintain the image of the new British, she said, okay, I can't do anything about that. And I think that that's what China's playing for. I think it's much more important to watch what China's doing politically and economically to Taiwan than to worry about militarily. For instance, for every report you get about, China considering invading Taiwan, you miss a report that says China's offering major incentives for Taiwanese semiconductor engineers to come move to the mainland, give them a nice posh penthouse in Shanghai and a nice stipend, whatever they want. The brain drain that is happening from Taiwan to China in some of these major tech industries, that's going to affect Taiwan in a major way. Look at the way that there are every year there are fewer countries that actually recognize Taiwan as an independent country of its own. The United States doesn't. We're willing to send weapons and have trade negotiations and things like that, but the United States doesn't recognize Taiwan as a country. What happens when 0 countries in the world recognize Taiwan as an independent country? Are they going to lift a finger if China decides that they want to sort of slowly incorporate it in? So, could I be wrong about that? Could Xi Jinping pull a Vladimir Putin? I was wrong about Putin. I thought he understood that he didn't have what it took to conquer Ukraine. I'm open to the same mistake here with China and Taiwan. But, if Xi Jinping does that, if he tries to invade Taiwan in the next 5 years, he'll fail. And the Chinese Communist Party will fall. And some of Peter's doom and gloom about China will be warranted.
Good point. Let's switch to investments. So, we just saw that you opened a short position, short at Germany, actually, on the German DAX. So what is your take on Germany? Why are you bearish on Germany?
Well, this is why it's good to be part of a team in general. So remember when I talked about that natural gas crisis in September, not at the investment firm, but in my own personal portfolio, and this is not investment advice, but in my own personal portfolio, I went long Germany right then and there. The short decision that we have at Cognitive Investments right now is really, that's more from the trading side. It's not from the macro side. From the longer fundamental side, if you look at our strategic wealth strategy, which is our longer 2 to 5 year strategy, we're actually sort of very constructive about Germany over that long-term time period. The short position right now is much more tactical. It's to say, look at the run-up that you've had from September until right now. Look at what's going on in the broader market with, the Chinese reopening was not what everybody thought it was going to be. There's the debt ceiling negotiations. U.S. equities have run up considerably. So that's really more of a tactical bet. It's not indicative of where we think Germany's going here over the next 2 to 5 years. I would be much more constructive about Germany over a 2 to 5 year horizon. And I think, in any market, you're going to get opportunities. If we get another energy crisis freak out at the end of this year in the winter, that might be an interesting time if you see that reflected in German equities to re-engage there. But so that's the logic behind that particular position.
What industry in Germany are you most positive about?
That's a great question. I can tell you the ones that I'm least positive about are the ones that are overly exposed to Russian natural gas. Like there are, industrials and fertilizers and glass makers and things like that. And this is not just Germany. This is in Hungary, Czech Republic. Some of these industries are going to have real difficulty. But I think the industry that I'm sort of there's really 2 that I'm most constructive on. The first is, and again, this geopolitics and sociopathic thing. I mean, the German military-industrial complex hasn't really had a German military or had export markets that it needed to serve for a long time. And between the German government wanting to build up Germany's military forces and between the German government now saying, hey, we're going to supply Ukraine with all of these different weapons and things like that, anything that's connected to that industrial complex, I would be relatively bullish and constructive on. The second is, as we get to this more decoupling world, this less globalized world in general, I think what's going to happen is that European companies are going to have to be more self-reliant, and the place that European companies have not been particularly good is tech. So yes, Germany has SAP, but in general, a lot of Europe doesn't have a cloud champion. It doesn't have these sorts of things. So that's another place where I would look. And then last but not least, it's going to be in the energy sector. And this is a place where I don't have the answer for you today. I don't know whether it's going to be, modular nuclear reactors, or it's going to be solar or electric vehicles, and what type of battery technology is going to happen. What we do know today is that there is an energy transition happening. And I think it's an opportunity on the order of magnitude, again, with the 1890s, early 1900s. In the 1890s, early 1900s, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that oil was going to be the energy technology that took off and dominated the entire world. I don't think we have a real clear sense yet of what is going to be that energy technology, but that's the conversation. That's the transition that's happening right now. And German companies are going to be at the forefront of that, in part because you did just lose that access to cheap Russian natural gas. So you're going to have to figure out what the future looks like. And, if I was talking to French interviewers, they'd probably be telling me about nuclear. You might be telling me something else. But it's that space. So energy, tech, and sort of military industrial complex is where I'd be looking.
Interesting. Okay, so let's start with emerging markets, and it was a surprising country that a lot of people don't have on their list, and it is, you already mentioned it, it's Poland. So why is you bullish on Poland?
Look, Poland is probably one of the biggest investment opportunities from this Russia-Ukraine war. Until, if you go back in time, even
Putin comes, invades Poland.
Look, until if we were here a year or two ago, Poland had some of the worst demographics in the European Union. And what's happened is we don't even know how many millions of Ukrainian refugees have streamed into Poland right now. When you talk to Poles, I was talking to a very senior Polish analyst who said, he doesn't know a Polish family that doesn't have a Ukrainian refugee in their own homes that they're housing themselves. Okay, that tells us something about the largesse and generosity of the Polish spirit. It also tells us they're going to have to build an awful lot of housing because these people aren't going to live in these people's homes for the rest of their lives. When you look at the limited data the UN does have about what are the demographics of those refugees that are in Poland, it's women and children. And they want to stay in Poland. They're not interested in going back to Ukraine because they've already felt what it was like to be in a war zone and they see some stability there. So overnight, Poland has this incredible demographic shot in the arm. You add on top of that, at some point, Ukraine is going to have to be rebuilt, and it's probably Polish companies are going to be the ones that are on the front lines there. They have the historical and cultural connections. They have some of the language capabilities. You can see that Polish companies are lining up. They want to be the ones that are front and center there. And then sort of just general macro, I think that as the European Union has to become a more powerful entity, it's going to have to build up those areas on the periphery. You can't maintain the European Union if you're not going to build up Eastern Europe and if you're not going to build up Greece and Italy and Spain and all of these sort of laggards. So I think for all those reasons, Poland's at an interesting confluence of a lot of different things.
Fair enough. Yeah. And makes sense to me. Let's switch to another country. Germany has a somewhat special relationship, I guess. Turkey.
Turkey is fascinating. I'm very bullish Turkey right now. I actually put out a research piece just last week that described described Turkey as probably the best emerging market opportunity of the decade.
Wow!
I will tell you right now, though, I have not lost my senses. I'm aware that prediction could blow up in my face, and I do have conviction in it. I put my name on it, but there's a healthy sort of level of caveating in that report, and I do think there are downside risk scenarios. These are emerging markets, so you sort of have to be able to pivot and see things change in real time. But the reason I'm so optimistic about Turkey, it's a couple reasons. The first are just straight geopolitical geography. There's a reason that Istanbul and Constantinople before it has always been a wealthy power center. It's at the intersection of the Black Sea and between Europe and the Middle East and Asia and Africa. It's very, very prime strategic real estate. So if you are dominating Istanbul and the Bosporus, you already sort of have a leg up. Turkey on top of that combines that with the strategic depth of Anatolia, but also has tens of millions of people who are well educated, who have demonstrated themselves to be extremely good workers. They're stealing market share from China. They're stealing market share from Europeans from making things like cars. It's really the only modern industrial economy in the Middle East. We can maybe make an exception for Israel, but Israel is extremely tiny and very tech-oriented. There is no other economy in the Middle East or really in that region that can do the things that Turkey can do economically. The big problem for Turkey in the last couple of years has been political. It's been this insistence by Erdogan that interest rates do one thing when we all know interest rates do another thing. And I think that has to do more with him getting political support and establishing his control over the country. I think what these Turkish election results show us is that there actually is a majority of Turks who believe in Erdogan's vision of that country. And what I expect to happen here over the next 12 to 18 months is that I think Erdogan will prevail in round two, and I think you will see a major pivot back to normalized monetary policy. And I think you will see foreign investors, all of whom have been wailing and gnashing their teeth about the things that Turkey's done in the past couple of years. I think that you'll see that they will see all of these different strengths, and that if you can just get some normal monetary policy out of the Turkish government, it'll be like Turkey was in the early 2000s, which is growing at a very high clip and taking advantage of all these geopolitical opportunities. So there's definitely a counterfactual there. Erdogan, he's proven that he has authoritarian tendencies. There is a real divide in Turkey between those that identify as more religious, those that identify as more conservative, than those that identify as nationalist. All of that has to be worked out here. But, you don't go to emerging markets because everything is clear. You go to emerging markets because you think that the potential over time is going to overcome some of those issues. So they're very real issues. And I would tell investors to be very careful because, I'm watching in real time every single day, trying to poke holes into my bullish thesis on Turkey. But that combination of, an advantageous geography. They've gotten through this tough election, and there's a real need to pivot to normal monetary policy. All of those things to me smell like opportunity.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So what is your most popular country in South America?
It's got to be Brazil. I mean, Brazil is, I think it was Charles de Gaulle who said in the 1960s that Brazil will always be the country of the future. Brazil has continued, it has all this potential on paper. You could probably find an analyst like me in every decade say, no, this is going to be the decade that Brazil really takes off. But here I am staking my name on Brazil to you here. One of the things I would tell your listeners to look at is just go look at a chart of long-term interest rates in Brazil over time. And you'll see that over the past 50, 60 years, interest rates have been getting lower and lower and lower. When you look, and the reason that interest rates were so high was because Brazil, it's a very conservative, oligarchic society. Small families own large land, plantations and agricultural interests and all these other things. It wasn't good to be a Brazilian entrepreneur. And I think that's beginning to change. I think you're beginning to see the young Brazilian entrepreneur rise. You're seeing the Brazilian government emphasize the ability to grow. So much of coverage of Brazil focuses on what crazy thing did Bolsonaro say, or what crazy thing did Lula say, but if you actually look at the polls, what do Brazilians really care about? The number one issue that Brazilians before the most recent election said was on the tops of their minds: tax reform. They want the boring stuff done. They want to cut the red tape. They want to grow. And if they can do all of that, Brazil is sitting on geopolitical opportunity. They have no rivals around them. Their only potential rival is Argentina, and the technical term for Argentina is a complete dumpster fire. I mean, Argentina is not going to challenge them in any meaningful way. What inflation is over 100% for the first time in Argentina since 1991. It really says something when Argentina is making new highs in inflation, considering their recent history. Brazil is not near any of the geopolitical great power competition in the Eurasian continent. Brazil has lots of natural resources. It's got plenty of oil. It's a major ag exporter. It really doesn't, fertilizer is the one sort of weak spot there. And it's the reason Lula's been a little more pragmatic when it comes to dealing with Russian Putin. So was Bolsonaro. But in general, Brazil has most of the resources that you would want to compete. And then it's an economy of scale. It's hundreds of millions of young people in a continent where Brazil really can dominate. So if you're looking at South America, Latin America in general, I think it's Brazil's game to lose. And if they can actually align policy with some of those fundamentals, you might actually see Brazil take off here. That's what I'm expecting.
I guess we fully agree on Brazil. How do you go about investing in Poland and Turkey and Brazil? Do you invest? Do you buy just an ETF? Do you go stock picking? Do you look at certain industries? What's your approach? Any advice also for our listeners? Because in Germany, most people don't invest or don't spend too much time thinking about emerging markets. And I think it's a big opportunity over the coming decade. And so we want to get people some tools to their hands, how they can approach those markets.
Yeah, I mean, this will be somewhat of a self-serving argument, but I'll say that and I'd welcome your guys' advice too, because this is actually really difficult. It's one thing to articulate a thesis. It's another thing to actually execute it. Yes, there are ETFs that are focused on Brazil and focused on Poland and things like that. But let's take the Brazil iShares ETF, for example, not to go after BlackRock, and just as an example. The iShares ETF for Brazil is what? I think it's, last time I looked, it was something like 19% Vale. That has nothing to do with Brazil. So that has to do with iron ore prices and Chinese consumption and Chinese construction and, sort of global commodity flows. You're actually not getting real exposure to what's happening in Brazil itself. So you can use ETFs to a certain extent, but my hope for cognitive investments as we grow over time is to actually build ETFs that reflect those economies and aren't just what are the biggest market cap companies? Let's throw them into an ETF and package them up and people will invest in them. So that's one problem. The second thing is, actually owning shares, and then you have to worry about currency hedging and things like that. But the best thing you can probably do is have some sort of relationship with a financial manager where you're owning the shares and you're also hedged on the currency basis, and you get to actually pick, okay, what bonds or what fixed income instruments or what equities am I most interested in from that perspective that I want to hold. And that's hard. That's not just as easy as, okay, I'm going to buy the Brazil ETF and suddenly I'm diversified. Well, not really, actually. It's actually the hard work of doing the research on the companies, going on the ground and deciding the ones you like, thinking really seriously about, okay, if I'm going to hold this in Brazilian real, how am I going to hedge with the euro or the dollar, or if things go sort of wonky there. But there's no easy answer, I think, if what you really want is exposure. But if you want to get started, ETFs are a good place to get started, to start learning about some of the opportunities that are out there, I think.
Okay. So from Brazil, it's very easy actually to switch to commodities, because we think there's also a big commodity super cycle ahead of us, or perhaps we're already in it. So global food prices are actually one of the best indicators to tell what's going on in the world. And we see a lot of fluctuation. If food prices go up, political turmoil is actually on the rise. So let's start with agriculture. You guys just made a bet on wheat, what you already mentioned. So just tell us your case on wheat.
Yeah, it's ironic. So geopolitical analysts, we think very long term about the fate of nations and different states. But I find when you're investing in commodities, like it's important to have that idea of a super cycle in the back of your mind. And some commodities I think are at the cusp of a super cycle. Copper, for instance, I think is at the cusp of a super cycle. A commodity like lithium, I'm much less sure about, and we could talk maybe a little bit more about that if you want. But so we've had two main agricultural bets this year. The first is that we were short soybeans tactically, and we just put on this long wheat position. The short soybean position, it's this investment philosophy. It's one of my favorite investment philosophies. Keep it simple, stupid. Brazil was coming up with huge soybean crops, more than enough to make up for the fact that Argentina was having a really disappointing crop this year because of drought in that particular part of the world. And, you know, I was getting to the point where I was wondering if the United States was even going to start importing beans from Brazil, because that's how cheap they were going to be. And when I started making that argument a couple months ago, I had people tell me I was nuts. Well, you had the first evidence of Brazilian soybeans being shipped into the United States a month ago, 6 weeks ago. You've been seeing that happening. And there is going to be this longer demand for soybeans because of its the role it plays in sustainable air fuel, in renewable diesel, biofuels, and things like that. But here right now, there's too many soybeans on the market for not enough crushing demand, whether it's for food or for energy purposes in general. Wheat is the flip side of this. So wheat has been beaten down here over the past couple of months. Wheat was really, really elevated to its historical price level because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Everybody was worried that the Russia-Ukraine war disruption was going to cause huge shortages of wheat. It didn't actually turn out that way because of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I think one thing we've learned about Russia here in the last 6 to 8 months, they may want to threaten to leave the Black Sea Grain Initiative. But the thing is, if they left the Black Sea Grain Initiative, if the Black Sea suddenly closed to wheat exports, the countries that are going to feel it the most are emerging market economies like in East Africa, in Southeast Asia, in South America. And because Russia's turned its back on Europe and the United States and Japan and the rest of the West, they can't afford to also piss off all these other emerging market economies too. So they want to say, oh, we want to end the Black Sea Grain Initiative. But when it gets down to it, as soon as they do so, they get African nations, they get Central Asian nations, they get all these nations coming out at them and saying, hey, Russia, we'll be quiet about Ukraine as long as you keep the wheat flowing in general. So that's, I think, what has brought in wheat prices down to its low. Now, what's changed here in the last month or two is really weather. If you look at anecdotal data in the United States, I mean, some of the farmers that I'm talking to, they're talking about the worst wheat crop, winter wheat crop in living memory. I've even seen articles comparing this to, 1917 sort of Dust Bowl era sort of things. And you're getting historically low winter wheat production in the United States, so much so that the United States is actually importing wheat from places like Poland right now, because it's cheaper to do that than to get it from places like Kansas, where the crop has just been decimated by the really bad weather conditions. So I think that there was a reason why wheat prices got beat down to where they are. I think they're probably hovering a little bit above $6. I think right now, if I can't remember exactly where they are right now, but there's a reason they've been beaten down so much. But I think they've been beaten down too much. In the meantime, the weather has turned, and I think the fundamentals are about to turn sort of back against it. The last thing I would say about the reason I'm a little more optimistic about wheat is that I think most projections don't really consider sort of where you're going to get increased demand from, especially in emerging markets. So, for instance, in East Africa, especially in Somalia, we were already talking about one of the worst famines of the last 30 to 40 years. So there's a lot of going to be wheat demand right there. Sudan is mired now in what is looking increasingly like a really bloody and grisly civil war. You've got the UN World Food Program coming out and saying this is going to be a terrible situation from a food security perspective, and they're raising money trying to make sure that they can get food aid into Sudan. Pakistan had those terrible floods last year and also had a particularly bad growing season. It's not looking that good again this year. Go a little bit further to Southeast Asia. You're getting record high temperatures in places like Vietnam, Cambodia. Another thing to sort of keep in mind here is that one of the reasons we didn't get an Arab Spring type revolution due to food prices in the world last year was because rice was the hero. Rice was able to produce. Rice was able to be that sort of substitute. You're also seeing pressure on rice right now. So when you sort of put all those things together, I think that the narrative on wheat reflects the old narrative. That sort of, we thought that Russia-Ukraine was going to close off Russian and Ukrainian wheat to global markets. That's the old story. The new story is there are weather issues, there's demand issues in emerging market economies, and maybe supply is not quite where the world thought it was going to be, despite the good news about the Black Sea Grain Initiative.
Unfortunately, I tend to agree. I look like at the wheat price chart every day, and maybe the bottom is already in, or we are very close to a bottom in wheat. But investment aside, actually, when I look at the wheat chart, I get somewhat worried, because if your outlook and our outlook is correct and wheat prices are about to go up over the next 12 months, we will see a lot of pain in the world. And you just mentioned famine in a few African places. If you would be an advisor to the German government, actually to any Western government, and you would tell them, well, there's a big problem coming to us. What can we actually do about it to prevent wheat prices from going up? Is there anything we could do to prevent all this famine? Because if we are right and wheat prices are going up, I always call it the most scary chart out there, because it would probably imply that a lot of people will die because they don't have anything to eat.
Yeah, I mean, I always, the way I'm to say what you're saying in a different way, I always say, if you put me on a desert island and said I could have access to one indicator that would tell me what's going on in the world, make it global food prices, because that's going to tell me how things are going, generally speaking. Look, you're exactly right. And I think I'll give you sort of the silver lining or the optimistic side here. We produce enough food in the world to feed everyone. There's no reason that anyone in the world should go hungry. It's really a logistics question and a politics question. It's also a question of waste. It's hard to get exact data here, but if you read different papers, we waste somewhere between 20 and 40% of the food that we consume in the world. If you look at a map of how much the crops that we grow that go to energy, like biofuels, versus that go to food, I think it's something like 45% or 50% goes into energy. So if you wanted to pivot here and provide enough food for everyone in the world, we have the calories. The problem here, and this is something I say to US farmers, it's something I say to agricultural audiences in general, I think, and I really don't know another market that is like this. Farmers have gotten really, really good. They're tremendously good at increasing yield and being more productive over time. And by doing so, they've driven down the cost of food. And the way that farmers make ends meet is not that the government comes in and sets a price or anything like that. The way that this works is that they export their excess abroad, and that's where farmers make their money. So that's why they're obsessed with market access in China, or what's going on with the famine in Africa and things like that. That's also what allows a country like Egypt to have 110, 120 million people. Egypt doesn't have the land resources to have 120 million people living on the two banks of the Nile River, but because there was all of this excess calories that all of these farmers in parts of the developed world had to export somewhere. Okay, so Egypt's population is allowed to grow because they have access to these cheap calories. So the thing that I would say is that the European Union is doing some of this, although I think the European Union is going after its farmers in an unproductive way. We see this with the Dutch farmer protests and the heavy-handed ways that the European Union is going about this. But you sort of have the right idea. We have to think less in terms of, okay, let's have farmers make more and more and more and drive down the cost of food cheaper and cheaper and cheaper for local markets. Why don't we allow farmers to provide and make a living for themselves with their local markets? And then on top of that, you can go and sell things abroad. Or maybe instead of countries like Ivory Coast and Ghana investing in cash crops like cacao and coffee and things like that, maybe they should grow foods that they can actually eat and have some level of food sustainability and self-sufficiency, and then work with them to give them the best technology so that they can produce just as much cacao and coffee. I'm not saying we have to abstain from coffee, but there's a way to do this in such a way that they can have their cash crops, but also where they can have sustainable agricultural practices and not be dependent on exports from really, really far away. That's all at the very mega level, though. In sort of the short term, I think you're absolutely right. And there are parts of the world that are going to suffer from food insecurity, and it's really just a question of how much. Now, the other sort of silver lining to put in your mind is We were worried about this last year too. In some ways, I was more worried about this last year from a global perspective than I am this year. This year, my concerns are much more hyper-focused. Like, I'm very worried about the Horn of Africa. I'm very worried about Sudan. I'm very worried about Pakistan. Last year, I was worried about just about everywhere. So in that sense, we've gotten a little bit better, but you're absolutely right that the more we squabble with ourselves and the more that we continue to do these things, the people who are going to suffer are those people in emerging markets who can't afford, who really can't afford any other way.
So do you see any opportunities in energy?
I see so many opportunities in energy, but maybe be a little more specific about what you mean. You mean like
coal,
specifically with
oil, gas, uranium. Which one?
Feel free to
favorite?
pick. What energy market do you find most exciting?
Renewables.
Nuclear, uranium.
Yes, and all of the above. I mean, we
Jacob is all in.
Say that again.
Jacob is all in.
Well, I don't know about all in, but there are definitely opportunities out there in general. I told you, I mean, I'm a little skeptical about oil. I think as long as that oil price cap is there, and as long as countries like China, India can get, oil at a discount from Russia, and you also look at the amount of supply that's out there in different places around the world, and if China's reopening is not as strong as it used to be, and you get these concerns about recession, I'm not so sure that oil is the place I would want to be right now. It looks to me to be treading water, and I think there could be some downside there. Natural gas, it seems to me we've gone from that doom and gloom sort of last fall and winter to now everything is apparently there's no moderate in between here. Now everything's going to be fine. I'm not so sure about that. I think especially as we move into El Nino, a new weather cycle in the world, maybe you are going to get a colder winter finally. Maybe you could see kind of a return of higher natural gas prices. But we talked about this a little bit earlier. I really do think we're at the beginning stages of an energy revolution. And I don't know which technology is going to win out. I can make the bull case for hydrogen. I can make the bull case for nuclear. I can make the bull case for hydro. There are interesting startups and publicly traded companies that are working in all these different areas. And it might be that different countries rely on different energy sources. That's another thing that's changing. Up until, or I should say, roughly for the last 100 years, a barrel of oil has meant the same thing to the entire global economy. Like, yes, Brent crude has one price and West Texas Intermediate has another price, but it's still a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil, and maybe there's some discounts based on location and things like that, but everybody uses barrels of oil the same way. Well, we're moving towards a world where maybe that's not so true. If you're a country like Chile, for example, and you have tremendous solar power potential because of where you are in the world, well, maybe Chile is going to be a solar dynamo, and maybe they're going to be the center of solar innovation just because that's where the sun shines and they have so much potential. The United States has already done this with fracking. The United States went from importing a bunch of its hydrocarbons from the Middle East to now the United States is a hydrocarbon superpower in and of its own right and is at the forefront of those sorts of things. If you look at where new nuclear capacity is coming online in the world, it's not Western Europe, it's not Japan, it's not the United States, it's India and China. That's where all the new reactors are coming online, and they have bet on they've bet on nuclear for a long time now, and you'll probably see that play out. Countries like Brazil or Argentina, this recent terrible drought that they had sort of adds insult to injury here, but they have tremendous hydropower potential in those parts of the world. So when it comes to energy, the answer to your question is yes. There are opportunities everywhere, but it's going to depend on local markets. It's going to depend on technological developments, and that's just sort of a case-by-case basis or a market-by-market basis.
Yeah, unfortunately in Germany, we haven't realized yet that the sun isn't shining as much as in Chile and other places, but that's a topic for a different day.
Well, I mean, maybe you guys can explain the psychoanalysis to me. I don't understand why Germany refuses to get on the nuclear train. It seems to...
It's because
almost too easy.
We're dogmatic. The Green Party in the government, it's dogmatic actually, and they just want to satisfy their voters, and that's it actually. It's the most stupid energy policy in the world we've ever seen. That's why we have the highest prices right now, and that's why we just shut off 3 perfect and actually well-maintained nuclear power plants, and now we have to buy fracking gas from the States, so you guys are happy about that, and it's stupid. We can't explain it. We are big opponents actually of this decision, but Germany is always very extreme. Sorry. It's no sense behind it. It's just
and
stupid.
Unfortunately, we are caught in the middle of this. But obviously, for a country like Germany, nuclear power is one of the ways to go. And I think a few people are coming around this idea, but it's probably still a minority. But
And we also have, we have coal, actually, enough coal for 1,000 years, but we paid billions of euros to shut them off, as well. And we have enough gas as well, but we are just too green because it's very woke right now. We have to be, we want to change everything, and we want to protect the environment, and the Germans are doing it at first. And it's stupid. It's very stupid, and it will cost us a lot of prosperity and actually competition as well.
Well, it also tells me that the quote-unquote crisis is apparently not that much of a crisis yet, because usually you'll get people shaken out of their stupidity or their complacency or whatever you want to call it when the crisis is real. But I mean, if anybody's listening to this who has any pull in the German government, I mean, even the Italians are coming around in nuclear. So unless you want to be
everybody, Netherlands, Poland, the Czech Republic, I think even Luxembourg or Liechtenstein is thinking about it, but we're not. No, just kidding. But yeah, it's because we're saturated, and it's a hubris we're living in, and it's decadency, I think. Yeah, it's ideological, dogmatic policy. That's it. It's always the same with socialists. That's the problem. You're laughing. So
it's the province of all ideologicals, but yes, I get you.
Yeah, and you will see the same in the States. Don't worry, Biden is doing the same, or the next president. So, but if you would have to choose one energy form for the next 5 years, would it be you would buy gas or uranium or coal or wind power? What would it be?
I'll cheat and give you two answers. If it's over the next 5 years, and it's not about holding the commodity itself, but I would want to be invested in companies that are either at the forefront of nuclear, whether that's small modular reactors or thorium. I mean, there's lots of interesting things that are happening in nuclear. I'd want to be sort of there. One of the analysts on our innovation advisory board, he works specifically in matter and materials for nuclear. So he doesn't work on fusion itself, but he's talked to me about how we literally don't have the materials that we would need for a fusion reaction itself. We don't have materials that can withstand the heat there. So what he's doing, and what he's doing with other researchers at MIT, is trying to figure out, find these new materials, these new alloys that we need. So that's one place. And then two, I think hydrogen is very compelling. Now, hydrogen's had previous moments where it was compelling. In the 1980s, people thought that hydrogen was going to have a moment. Hydrogen has its downsides. It's combustible is the most important one among them. But it seems to me that hydrogen is also a place where I'd want to be exposed, especially because you can retrofit some of those natural gas pipelines, because you don't have to go find all these mineral resources that have to go into batteries and things like that. I think it's nuclear and hydrogen are the two places where I'd want to be positioned, because those are the most disruptive and most innovative. Now, those, in some ways, those are also the riskiest. But if you're looking for the opportunity, I think it's companies that are in those two wheelhouses are where I'm most interested.
Okay.
Maybe let's finish off with a quick elevator pitch on copper and also lithium, a market you spend a lot of time thinking and researching about. So what about those two?
Well, look, copper, the copper case is relatively simple. So globally, copper mines, the ore quality that we're getting out of existent mines right now has been going down. So we're getting less quality copper, even though there's this production out there, and we haven't really been bringing new mines online. So supply is declining a little bit. China says that it's not going to continue just building ghost cities in the middle of nowhere. So that should be bad for copper, because a lot of the reason copper's gone up so much in the last 10, 20 years, like most commodities, is because the Chinese were consuming them. What's changed with copper is that you need copper still for building houses and all the normal things that you need copper for. But whether it's wind or solar or every single renewable energy technology needs more copper. So it looks like, and I think when you're making the bullish bet on copper, you're saying, okay, even as China consumes less copper, there's going to be enough copper demand in the emerging markets and developing world, plus the renewable energy transition, plus our normal uses of copper, plus the declining ore quality means we're going to have a lack of balance between supply and demand. I think that's the copper case. And that's really just a question of timing. When do you get in? What companies are you trying to hold? I mean, that's sort of an interesting puzzle there, but that's what the sort of 5-year time horizon looks like. Lithium, I don't know. I have a hard time believing that EVs and battery technologies as they're currently constructed are going to win the day. And that's just because we're trading dependence on one, resource, which is oil, for, 15, 20 other resources, some of which I can't even pronounce, that have even worse supply chains. Cobalt is sort of the perfect example. You need cobalt in a lot of these batteries that are going into EVs. 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Most of that cobalt is then in turn refined by China. So I mean, that's not going to work. Like, where are you going to get the cobalt so that all of us are going to be driving electric vehicles around the world? And that's just one mineral resource. And lithium is part of that. This is, again, why it's so important to be tracking what's happening with technological innovation. I don't know if this is going to go anywhere, but there was a Chinese journal that came out a couple of weeks ago that said they had some success with a sodium ion battery, maybe as an alternative to a lithium ion battery. Very early stages. I would bet that it's probably not going to work out. But if you had somebody that could produce a sodium ion battery, goodbye lithium, and suddenly maybe EVs get a lot more interesting. So all of this can change because of one scientific discovery in a lab somewhere halfway across the world. So I would caution listeners, like, there's a compelling case for lithium, especially if we do EVs the way that we're talking about doing EVs. And that might work anyway. We just talked about the stupidity of political policies. There are political policies in place to incentivize people to go get more lithium and to build these batteries and to build these electric vehicles. I could be totally right that electric vehicles are not rationally the right decision, and lithium could still be the best investment you could make in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm completely open to that. But I would be a little bit more cautious about lithium. It feels like a sort of mania to me, and I think it feels awfully toppy. I think there are other energy technologies that are more sustainable, that are more replicable, that will probably stand the test of time more than lithium, but we'll see.
Yeah, exciting times, definitely. We see a paradigm shift, and we just saw the last couple of months with artificial intelligence, how fast it progresses. And I think the same with, for example, new developments with energy and everything. And I don't think we will drive around with electric vehicles in the future as well. But hey, we will see. But it's definitely a great time to be alive. So we will see amazing discoveries and amazing developments in the next couple of years. And I think we should talk again, Jacob.
I would love to. And first of all, it's always a good time to be alive. And I hope that you'll want to talk to me again. For all I know, in 2 years' time, you'll just be interviewing ChatGPT, and I'll be out on the street.
Exactly. And you will paint your house, and we're just talking to your
virtual agent,
to your clone or something. Same here. Actually, we're not here right now because we're both actually on the beach. But hey, you didn't see or didn't realize it, so that's okay for us. No, just kidding. Yeah, next time perhaps both clones will talk to each other. That's fine for me as well. Talking to you in person in real life, it would be marvelous as well.
Sounds great.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Of course. Cheers.
Last but not least, Jacob, where can people learn more about you?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. You made sure I didn't get in trouble with my marketing.
You need to show your podcast, Jacob.
Yes. So the short thing is go to cognitive.investments. That's our website. You can find everything about me and the services that we provide there. Some of those services include wealth management services. I write a free weekly newsletter if that's your thing. I have a podcast series called Cognitive Dissidence. You can find the link there as well. We also have a research platform for either multinational companies worried about supply chains or family offices, things like that. All of that stuff lives at the Cognitive Investment website. So you can also always email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. I won't respond to all my emails, but I assure you I read all of them. So I'll put myself out there as well.
Okay. Yeah, we put all the links in the show notes, of course. And are you on Twitter as well?
For now, I am still a sadomasochist, and I'm still accepting the experience of being on Twitter. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Jacob. It was great talking to you. Thank you for your wisdom and picking your brain. And I think in 1 year we come back and then we see how your predictions went out. So then we see what happened to copper or lithium or whatever.
That'd be wonderful.
Take care. Bye.
Take care.
Right,
Bye.
Take care. Bye.